Hi, and welcome back to another episode of DSC's Charity Questions. And today I've got Mike Winstanley with me from the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, where he's head of, is it the South and the East Yorkshire of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, Mike?
South and West Yorkshire, George.
You just told me 2 minutes ago, South and West. There we go. Great. And so, Mike, I've known for a long time after I joined a course you were attending once. And then as soon as you told me what your old job was, which was head of river restoration for the Severn River Trust, I got my claws into Mike and wouldn't let him out my sight for a couple of years. And actually, that meant him helped me with a lot of projects outside of DSC. And actually, he also contributed, very importantly, to a chapter on water that I wrote in my book. So I've known Mike for a long time, and I'm constantly asking Mike for things. So it's probably no surprise to you, Mike, when I popped up into you the other day and said, please join our podcast, because I really, really want to get a wildlife orientated charity on here. Because, well, like the joke we just made, wasn't it? You can't talk to beavers and ask them what they want, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about ecotherapy, but we're also going to talk about wildlife focused charity work. And of course, we're going to talk about you, Mike, as well, and your journey to go from river restoration to ecotherapy to obviously this role you're in now at the biggest wildlife trusts in the UK. So welcome to the podcast, Mike. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, George. Yeah, wonderful introduction and a great opportunity to share some of my story for nature. Thank you.
I love it. Exactly. Yeah. And so I've been hugely inspired by you, Mike. And yeah, I mean, a little bit jealous of some of the roles you've held as well. Some really cool roles you've done. So at the moment, you're at the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and you're obviously working in conservation for a long time. And is there an inspiration to do this work that you kind of found as a young person, an adult? Where's this inspiration come from?
So yeah, no, it's an interesting question. Simply because, I'm 58 these days, 58 years young, and my story goes back to early teens. So when I was 13 or 14, my brother and I got sort of left a bird guide and a pair of binoculars from our late sort of grandfather, and for whatever reason, that just really clicked with us at the time to sort of bird watch and understand birds and nature and that type of thing. And we very quickly really got into it. And over the years, we sort of spent the local country parks and worked with local wardens and this type of thing. And I just decided it was a line of work I really wanted to get into, and hopefully make a career at some stage. And so I was lucky at 19 to get my first job as a countryside warden in Bolton, in the River Valleys over there. So I kind of cracked it. You know, I'd done years of voluntary work, done a lot of serious birding. But sort of realised a bit of a dream back then and started that work. So, I mean, that sort of took my career then. And then, as you say, through a few twists and turns that we'll share with listeners as we go through this interview, I've ended up in Yorkshire at the Wildlife Trust.
So what did that first job entail? Can you just say what it was again? It was head of country.
So so at the tender age of 19, I was an assistant countryside warden.
Love that, countryside warden.
And sort of back at that time, George, there was a lot of local authorities that had invested into countryside wardens and countryside rangers and that type of thing. And we were very much the sort of generalists of the sector. You know, we weren't experts or anything, sort of jack of all trades, and got involved in lots of things around working with people, improving footpaths, leading guided walks, creating habitats for nature, studying nature, etc. Very much a lot of things encompassed into a role, but with a focus on a country park or a countryside area. And that was the job at the time. Now, unfortunately, those sort of countryside services have fallen foul of budget cuts over the years, and you don't tend to see as many as you used to. There still are some out there, thankfully, and it's a great sort of opportunity for young people in particular to sort of join the sector through that work with local authorities, etc. So that's kind of one way in, but it was very much a good opportunity to sort of really sort of learn the skills around countryside management that did include some nature conservation work.
Nice. So I'm going to ask you a birding question, because I didn't know this about you, actually. So if you were going on a birding trip in the UK, where would you go?
Well, I just love the coast. So I would always head out to the coast. And if I was doing that this next weekend, George, it's an easy trip for me these days, because I live in Huddersfield.
Yeah.
I've got the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust's coastal nature reserve at Flamborough Head to visit.
Yeah.
Or I can visit our friends at the RSPB over at Benton Cliffs and enjoy some fantastic seabird experiences. So that's that would be my go-to just at the moment.
Nice. I like that. So leaving the sea then. So as I said earlier, I met you when you were doing your river restoration work and found that hugely inspiring. I've been preaching about beavers, #beavers without borders for a long time. Obviously the work of the Beaver Trust. So in your role, I'm going to assume it was more river focused, right? And nowadays it's a little bit more broad. So how has your priorities sort of changed from focusing on rivers now to this broader role at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust?
So it was interesting when I was sort of lucky enough to join the Severn Rivers Trust back in around 2018. I was sort of really attracted to it because I knew the chief executive there well at the time, Mike Morris. And we talked about a new role, which would be this head of river restoration for the trust. And it was very much about broadening some of the interests of the Rivers Trust at that time into more sort of biodiversity, more nature conservation type aspects of work, and away from some of the more technical river-based work around water quality and that type of thing that a lot of Rivers Trusts spend a lot of time working on. And that worked to a degree, but the challenge was that almost the problem was at the time was we I don't know if you remember, we went through some horrific flooding in the country that winter, and that changed the focus. A lot of statutory bodies like the Environment Agency were very influential in the Rivers Trust work, and it put a real emphasis on managing floods and mitigating against floods. So the job kind of changed a little bit for me, and I realised that my expertise, my interests, my ability sort of lay more in general nature conservation, if you like, which attracted me to the role in Yorkshire. But the work of the Severn Rivers Trust, I mean, some of the work I did there, George, was phenomenal. I mean, I was really lucky enough to be involved in some of the latter work associated with a massive project down there called Unlocking the Severn. That was basically unlocking miles and miles and miles of the River Severn for fish passage. Because basically the River Severn used to play host to hundreds of thousands of fish called shad. And they used to be harvested in Shrewsbury. Some of these wonderful cultural heritage stories along the river, but they've been lost. And they've been lost because of the Industrial Revolution, etc.
Locks as well. Like, what's the?
Well, it was sort of it was the creation of weirs and all that type of thing. Because shad, unlike salmon, are very lazy. They'll sort of huddle around the base of a weir, thinking, "What's going on? Who's put this here?" Whereas salmon will tend, leap it and carry on upstream. So the whole project was very much geared around raising awareness of this population of shad that want to be there. They want to get upstream, and basically a lot of the fish passage was to enable that, and it worked, and it was absolutely amazing piece of work. And so it was great to be part of that, but it was all very technical fish passage work, river-based work, etc. So it was very focused. And then, as I said, it sort of moved on to that sort of flood mitigation. So my background, as I talked about earlier, is very much in birds, in nature generally. So to move to the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and begin to look at that really was playing to my strengths and interests. And fantastic time at the Severn Rivers Trust, and I learned so much, and I was really grateful to be hand on a piece of work with lots of new projects, lots of new initiatives to obviously my successor, which was super.
Yeah, and I think so that cultural piece so we knew that they were harvesting shad in Shrewsbury because culturally we could tell. Because I think sometimes we're in this mess and we don't remember what it was like. So I find that really interesting that there was that cultural piece. Do you think there was any other sign that we were supposed to have shad further up? Would it have just been expected, or is it sort of that cultural piece that told us to kind of go down that path?
Very much the history, very much the culture. And of course that sort of work. I mean, many people sort of say, "Well, why are you spending so much money on one species of fish?" But of course, it's not, because if you open up the river, straight away you're opening up the river to a whole range of other species, not least the salmon. Exactly. And not least species like sea trout, etc., that need to migrate up the Severn. So by having the focus on the shad with the wonderful sort of historical stories and the stories that related to people, we were opening up the river to other iconic species such as the Atlantic salmon.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of the crux of why I find this work so fascinating, because I work as a trainer, as a fundraising trainer, and a lot of the times it's like nothing about them without them. Let's go and talk to the people this project is for. What do they want? Is there one thing we could have done differently? And you can't go and speak to the shad, right, and say, well, what did it used to be like? And we spoke about the beaver, birds, badgers, entire habitats. How do you decide what you need to focus on in your role?
Yeah, that's an amazing question, because as you say, unfortunately, we can't just sit down with them and have that chat and sort of say, what do you need? Where do you want to be? What does life look like for you? What are the pressures? We can't do that. So in some ways, unfortunately, we've got to make a number of assumptions. But these days, what we're getting better at making is very well-informed assumptions. We've created a knowledge base over the past 40 years in particular that's given us some really insightful data on the needs of many key species of birds and mammals and Lepidoptera, such as butterflies and moths and plants, etc. So, we've got some excellent data that informs that. But I think, the work we've been doing at the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, for example, over the past few years is pulling together a lot of that information to give us to show us a snapshot of where we are in Yorkshire, for example, for nature. And unfortunately, it shows the same picture as it does across the whole of the UK, which is a massive loss of biodiversity over the past 40 or 50 years, to the extent where we can unfortunately confidently say we've lost over 60% of the biodiversity that we had 50 years ago to today. And that is just eye-watering. It's just frightening when you think of that loss. In Yorkshire, potentially we've lost over 2,000 different species.
And is that including plants, trees?
Absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And it's just unbelievable. But we've got the data to show that. Now, on the other hand, that information, that data, that knowledge now gives us an insight into what we can do about it.
Do funders respond to that data? Like, is this a conversation, easy?
Absolutely. A lot of the funding these days, George, is becoming bigger funding, if you like. It's more combined. It's larger pots of money that requires it to be information-led, evidence-based interventions, the sort of projects we're putting together, very much based around effective partnership working, lots of stakeholders involved. So that sort of grows the project immensely over what we used to do perhaps a few years ago. But what that does give us access to is longer term funding, which of course for the work we're doing, it needs that long term sort of input. And this whole idea of being able to talk to the animals and understand what they need, one thing we know we need is long term interventions. It's no good doing a project for a couple of years and then moving on to the next, because you're barely scratching the surface. So we know we've got to be around, hopefully, for decades, working with habitats, monitoring populations, etc. Because really, that's the only way we can make a real difference.
And is there a way, so I'm not sure, is Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, is there ownership of these areas where you have kind of safe havens for nature, or are these places that you're kind of leasing access to? Where's the ownership for the actual land itself?
It's a bit of both, to be honest. I mean, one of the differences to my work now from when I was at the Rivers Trust is very much the fact that we do own land. We do lease land to manage for nature, and for people, of course, but predominantly they're nature reserves to protect the nature interest. And I mean, one of the pieces of work that we did as part of the State of Yorkshire's Nature Report, whilst we were on the one hand horrified at the findings of loss, some of the solutions that we've got in hand for that is very much about how do we begin to connect these important areas for nature? How do we begin to make them less fragmented and less isolated, so that, yes, a nature reserve has a value for the nature on that reserve. But of course, what does it do when it peeks over the fence and looks beyond? Often the habitat's not there. So they're literally kind of locked in to that nature reserve, and what we know now is that that's just not sustainable. That's not going to help that population, and it's not going to enable it to thrive and sustain. So we know we've got to make those landscape scale connections now. But of course, that creates massive challenge and needs those bigger funding pots. But that is part of the solution now.
And to maintain it as well. Yeah. I mean, I've just driven through Norway last week, and you drive along a main road and they've dug a whole bridge out underneath that's fenced off from humans for the animals, right? For the moose. And absolutely, there's a human benefit. There's no moose on the road causing accidents, but at the same time, it connects those two woodlands that potentially the moose, yes, can cross the road, but maybe the small insects can't, and they take decades to travel an acre potentially, right? Generations. And that's what this is what you're talking about. We've lost that connection between these areas, this resilience that comes from this connected network.
It is ultimately that resilience, but I think the thing we've always struggled to get become accustomed to in this country is the fact that actually we're quite a small island. We haven't got a big land mass. We've got a growing population with the growing pressures of infrastructure, etc., that brings on it. But of course, probably over 70% of the available land in this country is farmed. Yeah. And that's absolutely right, because we need to generate our food, etc. Yeah. And we know that. But what we've never quite established fully and effectively is how do we integrate farming? How do we integrate urbanization with nature? Or more accurately, how do we bring nature into our lives, basically? How do we do that successfully? Yeah. We've never quite grasped that. And I think that's led to quite a lot of the disconnect that we've got these days. And of course, the loss. So the more we can do to connect, the more we can do to include nature into farming. And many farmers do some fantastic work on that. Absolutely do. But of course, we know the current situation in terms of finances for farmers, for their livelihood. So we've got to do something about that to create that space for nature.
Yeah, and I mean, there's maybe, I don't know too much about this, but in certain books like Rebirding, they talk about the lamb farming and the damages that causes. And actually, we could get our lamb from New Zealand and stop farming lamb, but then obviously whole livelihoods would be lost. And also, again, the word resilience, if we are an island nation, we're then relying on a country, the other side of the world, to feed us, which may be in a destabilizing global climate situation is dangerous as well. I wonder politically whether we would make that leap, even though that could be optimum. So we're tracking data, we're going and collecting information, obviously lots of expertise there. Is there some things that are maybe actually easier as an environmental charity? You're saying there's now more support. Is there anything else like that that's kind of the bandwagon's now rolling, should we say?
I think there's an interesting link there to what we've just been talking about, simply because if now that we know we need to be working at scale more, if now that we know we need to stop working on little isolated sites called nature reserves and think bigger, the work of the Lawton report about 13 years ago in this country that reported for government on the need for bigger, better, more joined up. And that's very much the sort of mantra of the work we're doing in the Wildlife Trust movement, never mind just the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. But that does, whilst on one side of it, you might think that working at scale, that's going to be really problematic, really challenging. And of course it is, it's not easy. But what it does open, it sort of gives us options to some of these, what we call rewilding principles and nature-based solution principles. And it means that we're not always working very intricately and technically on a nature reserve for a particular species. It means that we can cast our scope across the landscape and think more about what's going on in that landscape for nature anyway. What are the nature-based solutions? What are the processes that we can simply align with rather than try to control on a very small scale on a reserve? So that suddenly opens it up and makes it easier in theory, in principle, because you're simply working with what's there anyway, rather than trying to introduce a new management regime for a particular species.
And it's not always possible.
That's one way.
Yeah, because it's not always possible to get out the way, but that would be the end goal, right? Just to get out the way. And the argument of us being keystone species, well, we're not, I don't think.
The part of the difficulty around sort of promoting the concept of rewilding, George, as you probably know, is that we don't have the ecosystem in place in this country. And so the difficulty with simply moving out of an area and leaving it to its own its own development is the fact that the ecosystem that would have naturally occurred in this country thousands of years ago simply doesn't exist. And so because of that, you're always going to have an unbalanced result for nature and therefore it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Nature will recreate itself. Nature will restore itself and become nature in a natural based area. But it won't be a fully functioning ecosystem, simply because if you think of the fact we don't have apex predators in this country, for starters, you haven't got that part of the ecosystem working. You haven't got the deer, for example, therefore being controlled naturally.
Yeah.
You've got overgrazing happening, therefore you've got them chewing down and feeding on new tree growth. You've got that negative knock-on effect backwards all the time, which just means that rewilding in this country has got to look different than it does in Scandinavia, for example, or in North America.
True.
It's going to be a different type of thing.
Yeah, and even in Norway, they have low populations of wolves because of the people will shoot them when they get on the land, and there's still fractured relationships. You can understand why we have no wolves and bears, as much as that has impacted the health of our ecosystems, right? So where we obviously met from this whole kind of ecotherapy perspective, actually, and you brought your perspective as a counsellor as well to our expertise when we met. And a lot of people, I'm sure you would put yourself down as one of these, I would absolutely say this, have found personal healing in nature. And I've found a lot of success when I'm talking about conservation by showing people why, and showing people foraging and herbalism, and encouraging them to take medicinal plants and use them. And those skills, I think, finding a porcini mushroom, for example, help to ground people in their local area and understand why we're protecting this stuff. And so I just wondered, with your background as a counsellor as well, what role you think ecotherapy or nature-based projects can actually have on the well-being of our country, shall we say?
I mean, that whole sense of being healed by nature, George, as you know, it resonates with me immensely. And I think it kind of answers the question you asked me about what inspired me right at the beginning of the interview. Looking back and in hindsight, I think it was that very early connection that made me feel very much at ease in nature. And it gave me that sense of feeling like I fitted in with something. And therefore it helped, because it meant that I had a role. I wasn't, that loner anymore. So I had somewhere where I fitted and somewhere I could play a part. And that was nature. And that has followed me, as you know, throughout my sort of career, from countryside management into sort of psychology and mental health care, and then back into the sector, as you say, via something we call ecotherapy, which is simply just being active in nature. And by being active in nature, it's hard to generalize, but I would offer that I have never met anybody who hasn't benefited and who has said they haven't benefited by being in nature. Absolutely. We all get very different things. Right? It's a very individual experience connecting with nature. But it's easy to sort of generalize that it does everybody good and everybody should be out there. But I think it's more nuanced than that. And I think it's just that sense of creating access to nature and creating opportunities for people to find what nature means to them. And so for me, in the work I've done as an ecotherapist and as a sort of counsellor, because I've incorporated outdoor therapy into that work. And the one thing that sort of clients tell me fairly early on is that it just feels like a great leveler. It feels like everybody's equal in nature. There's no counsellor or client, there's no expert in the room. We just sat outside talking about life, and we're using nature as that backdrop, and it's very calming. It's a lovely place to be, and we're all experiencing in that moment the positive benefits. And of course, during the lockdown of COVID in 2020, again, it was a little bit of a cliche it became in terms of, getting out into nature, and it's done me so much good. And I've heard birds for the first time, and I've not heard traffic, and all these things were played out. And it was fascinating to see a nation really come to sort of understand the importance of nature and natural environments in all our lives, And unfortunately, some of that's been lost a little bit, but nevertheless, it showed the importance at that time. So I think there's lots of nuance there in terms of what it means for the individual. But I think nature plays such a strong part in all our lives.
Yeah. Someone that's come on this podcast, a guy called Ken Burnett, he wrote a book called Storytelling Can Change the World. And he said there's two things that change the world: a story and a crisis. And I think you're right, Mike. We had that crisis. And people were, well, I'm going to get my 2 exercises a day. You told me I can go out twice. I'm going to have them both in nature. And we saw that benefit, didn't we? But you're right. Maybe that crisis has fallen to the side and potentially routines have taken over. And we've now got to get the stories back, haven't we? And what are these stories of people spending time in nature in these high entropy environments that we know are calming, both scientifically and spiritually as well, if we want to use that word. And do you feel like you always have a strong base of volunteers at the Wildlife Trusts, as from what I've seen anyway? Has there been like a growing desire for people, or is it the opposite? What's kind of happening there?
Yeah, I mean, volunteer. I mean, when I was at Lancashire Wildlife Trust and I was sort of involved in a lot of the ecotherapy work there, we were lucky to work. In fact, the project I was working on at that time called MyPlace, which was the ecotherapy sort of project, was we did some work with the University of Essex through the Wildlife Trust movement, and they did a lot of research on the health benefits of volunteering, etc., and ecotherapy activities and things. And it won't come as a surprise to anybody, George, either yourself or your listeners. And you know, the outcome of that whole research was that volunteering is good for you. Yeah. Volunteering in nature is even better for you. You know, and all these effects were very much true. But certainly that very much sort of confirmed what we've known in the Wildlife Trust movement for decades in terms of the benefits that our fantastic volunteers take from their experiences with the trust and working in nature, the massive benefits as a movement that we receive back from our volunteers, you know, is absolutely phenomenal. So to be able to promote volunteering with the trusts on the basis of it offering well-being benefits as well as the day-to-day improvements of managing for nature, it's such a bonus. Absolutely. But in terms of, you know, the numbers of volunteers come in, we get a steady sort of stream of inquiries from people interested in sort of joining us. But it seems quite stable, and there's actually quite a lot of thinking going on at the minute in terms of how do we sort of reach out to people who might want to volunteer, but for whom it just feels a little bit exclusive at the moment, you know, nature conservation type volunteering. So we have a bit of work to do on that to really try and opening it up, because so many people could benefit from so much in terms of just volunteering in nature.
Yeah, and it feels like nature, there's a big diversity piece in nature at the moment as well. Access for diverse groups, and I think that's also really important, isn't it? Maybe sometimes I've heard people say to me they don't feel welcome in those spaces, and I think this is all part of that, isn't it? Nature is not here to pick or choose anything; it's here to be open for everybody, and we have to promote that through organisations like yourselves and obviously government pieces. So I'm going to go for a big question then, and you don't have to share anything, Mike, but you've already spoken about your experiencing birding as a young lad with your brother, but is there any other moment maybe in your adult life where you've just felt that time in nature was a really transformative experience for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple I'd love to share, and one takes me back to 14 or 15.
Let's go.
And the reason I go back to that is because of the spectacle, George, at the time, and it's also a spectacle you can't enjoy anymore. And so basically my brother and myself used to go down to the Welsh Pembrokeshire Islands of Skocum and Skoma in the early 80s, you know, going back a long time. And so we used to go there and stay on the islands for a week at a time. So we lived out there, no electricity, no internet, none of this going on. But it was absolutely just switching off in nature. But one year we were lucky enough to go and take a boat ride out to Grassholm, which is the RSPB reserve, which is the gannetry. Wow. So 25,000 breeding pairs of gannets. Wow. You know, you approach this island and it's just a big white rock in the sea, and it's phenomenal. Wow. But back in the day, you could land and actually go onto it and sit next to nesting gannets.
Oh my goodness me!
Now we did that as teams, and that experience, George, was just phenomenal. It was like every David Attenborough program encapsulated into one moment. Yeah. The smells, as you can imagine, but the noise and the experience of literally being there on a rock miles out to sea with gannets was surrounded just by life. Yeah, phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
So you can't do that anymore? People can't do that?
You can't go on the island anymore. So, you know, you can, and a couple of years ago, I went on a boat trip and we just bobbed around it and looked at it, and I just remembered, and it was amazing.
this is part of the problem, I think, is that we've got these rules and they've been created because someone obviously was a bad egg when they went there and created this environment which wasn't safe for the birds and wasn't appropriate. So we had to change the law, and it's the same with the wild camping law, although that's recently been upheld in Dartmoor. It would be legal around the whole country if we were all responsible, and that's a shame because it's a core memory for you, clearly, that's led to a work in conservation, and maybe there's some young people out there that would have done the same for if they'd had that same opportunity. But it's...
Well, I mentioned two, and
I want to hear the second two.
I would love to share the set because it's very much, it just aligns with exactly what you've just said, George. So when I was lucky enough to be on the MyPlace project at Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and I still get a chill up my spine thinking about this because it was inspirational, and the young lady involved still doesn't know the effect it had on me at the time, but it was phenomenal. And so basically, the MyPlace project was working with the Lancashire NHS at the time, and it was basically setting up a referral program for young people, but people generally who were referred by their GP into Lancashire Care mental health services.
Okay.
And what we put in place with them was the MyPlace project as a potential referral pathway. So people referred into services could be sort of promoted and referred on to the MyPlace project for 12 weeks. And so some young people did that. And I remember a young lady who I'll call Claire. Claire turned up and she was very typical in that she was really experiencing some severe low-level sort of mental health issues, lots of low confidence. But bless her, she had the courage to come along and give this thing called MyPlace a go. So, of course, she turned up. We sat in a woodland, all of us together, and Claire sat on a stump about 10 feet away from everybody else, just observing and just getting used to it and learning and all that type of thing. And, of course, that was fantastic. She was there. That was the main thing. So Claire turned up week after week and did exactly the same for about a month and a half. And then slowly but surely got involved with the activities, her confidence built. You know, she really enjoyed the campfire work we did and some of the nature work we did, and just got more and more invested to the point where she was beginning then to help mentor some of the new young people coming in.
Nice.
And her confidence just built and built. And the moment that gives me the chill up the spine, because it was like that she's made it moment, was when the BBC wanted to do a live BBC breakfast piece on MyPlace.
Wow.
And she said she wanted to do an interview.
Wow.
And I remember picking her up at 4:30 in the morning to go to the site where we were going to meet the camera crew and all this type of thing. And she kept sort of, you know, saying, Mike, I can't do this. I want to do it. I just can't do it. Yeah. And we got through the morning and she did it. And the work she did, the sort of story she told was just absolutely phenomenal. So she'd gone from, in 3 months, from somebody really nervous, getting used to the project, wanting to get involved but struggling to somebody who then went on live breakfast television to talk about her journey and about the project. Wow. Absolutely phenomenal.
Wow. Fair play. Well done.
So as you can guess, that's kind of stayed with me a little bit.
Yeah. Well, no, it's going to stay with me. That's
wonderful moment.
Sometimes nature encourages these environments of healing, and I put it down to these high entropy environments, right? We can't take in the space when we're in nature because it's so chaotic and randomness and the patterns in the leaves and the bark, and it just allows the brain to just shut off a little bit. And sometimes we get rid of that noise, and actually then things can come to us. So that's incredible. You had that opportunity,
and that's the key, George, isn't it? Because I think, you know, it's quite funny. I feel I'm in a real juxtaposition at times because I've got to have this so-called expert insight in terms of nature's recovery, nature conservation, knowing about species and habitats. But actually, the therapist side of me says, hang on a minute, nature is just there. You don't need to know what that bird is. You don't need to know what that leaf has come from. You don't need to know why that fungus is growing out of that tree. None of that matters. It's about that relationship in the moment. And that's both empowering, but a little bit of a push and pull for me at times, as you can imagine.
I'm heavily scientific and only really opened up to spirituality with my wife and through nature and spending time in these spaces. When I've been on, previously I said I was in Norway, we did a week of Stone Age with somebody called Lynx Vilden, and she asked us a lot to not think about the names of the plants as well. and to think about where they're growing and what type of year. And actually, it's not about the name that we've given them. It's about other things to do with the plant. And it's exactly what you've just said there, isn't it? And I think the more time some people spend in nature for especially practical reasons, or actually being in nature and using it for survival or whatever means, I think that you do build a different relationship with the forest. And I really like that. And I think I'm sure that came through in that MyPlace project as well. Do you know if that's still running?
It is still running. The trust are doing such a fantastic. I mean, the team, an absolutely amazing team, and they've managed to sustain it. It looks a little bit different now. They're working with they were working with unemployed adults as much as they were working with young people. The referral work with the Lancashire Care National Health Service out there will still be present, but it kind of evolves. But the great thing is, it's still there. And working in the Lancashire Wildlife Trust area, so it's phenomenal. And to be frank, George, it's something I want to try and emulate in Yorkshire. So absolutely, I've got plans for how we can bring MyPlace to Yorkshire.
Yeah, and I think this is it: getting people to realise actually there's a human that needs to be involved in this rewilding process, and we are also people that have evolved alongside nature. And no, we don't put a wall around it and say deers, wolves, and bears only. We go humans in too, but in the right way, right, appropriately.
Well, it's so important, isn't it? So important, because what we can't do is we can't work with nature in isolation. Because we kind of run up against some of the issues we've had for decades, which is that lack of connection, and that means that lack of resilience. And we must have people. We've just got to create that awareness for everybody to understand how nature can be part of their lives, and win those hearts and minds, really.
Absolutely, and could also be part of our food process and water process and resilience from flood defences through beaver networks. And it's going to take a little bit of changing, maybe where we build homes instead of on floodplains and all of that other kind of societal stuff. So I had a question written down, which I think we've covered a little bit already, but I wanted to ask you about a small way somebody maybe listening to this who sat here and thought, crikey, I need a little bit of this. I need to get a bit of tree therapy, forest therapy. We kind of use these words, don't we? Is there a small suggestion you might have to our listeners today if they are feeling that they want to start their nature therapy journey, what you would suggest they do?
The wonderful thing about this type of approach, or this awareness, George, as you know, is it can happen on so many levels, and so it can be really individualistic. It can be very much appertaining to just that individual in the moment. And I think, the simple thing to say is that you can enjoy nature, you can bring nature into your life wherever that might be. So if you're lucky enough to live near to a nature reserve or a nice landscape like a national park, etc., you can simply go out there. And usually we know that people who do live near those areas often visit them and take all the benefits in. Part of the challenge we've got as a population is that, probably around 1 in 3 people only have, 1 in 3 people don't have access to that sort of quality environment. And so there's so many of our population sort of being excluded from it. But I think, what we can all do is we can all recognise the sort of joy that nature brings us simply by taking a moment to either remember a really happy experience or look at a picture. I mean, there's research that shows that even people in hospital recuperating from operations, by simply having a picture of some bluebell woodland on the wall, it's been shown to actually improve the recovery. Absolutely. And that's just phenomenal, isn't it? Absolutely phenomenal. So we can just simply look at a picture and imagine our time there. But I think it all comes down to that sort of mindfulness sort of scenario where you're just stopping, you're switching off, as you said earlier, George. You're just taking a moment, closing your eyes, perhaps, taking some deep breaths and just relaxing with nature in mind. Absolutely. And it is very much about not looking at that screen, switching off from the trials and tribulations we all have in life, and just take a moment for you and breathe.
Absolutely.
Perhaps feel a breeze on your face, on your hands. Perhaps listen to the bird song, or perhaps just listen to the rustling of some just noticing nature really in the moment can be so powerful.
I love it.
It's easily said, but it does take a little bit of practice. And I think, for all of us, when we try to do that, sometimes it can feel a little bit forced and might not work. But what I would offer your listeners is stick with it. Yeah. Just give yourself, a couple of minutes of experiencing it, and it will become sort of second nature, and it'll become a very useful calming technique then once you've just got practiced in it a little bit. Because it feels a bit strange at first. It's a little bit like some of these techniques. It feels a bit strange if it's not something that you use, accustomed to doing, but it does work.
I find that's the tip there, isn't it? And I remember starting breath work and just very light nasal breath work with my wife, who's a breath work coach. And I was made redundant from a job. And when I told her on the phone, she said, we've got to do the breath. And the angry part of me was like, I don't want to do the bloody breath. I just want to be in this anger state. But that was obviously wrong. And it's the same, I think, with nature. Sometimes it might not feel like we want to give ourselves permission to have that safe space and that safe moment. And that's when we've got to push through the most, actually. And just simply take yourself away to an environment that is a green space in whatever capacity, and do an inhale through the nose and exhale through the nose. And if that, I don't know what you would say to this, Mike, but from my perspective, if that doesn't help me, that's when maybe I know that I've got to go and signpost to someone else and go and tell someone else about it. Talk to my wife, talk to a professional like Samaritans or Calm or 111. And that's my kind of coping method for high stress or high anxiety situations is nature. And I know if that doesn't work, then maybe there's something deep down that actually I need to start addressing and looking to as well. I don't know what you think about that.
I agree. I think, these we sort of all build up our own coping mechanisms. We know what works for us because we recognize those triggers that create the stressors, etc. And so we've all got a way to cope with that. Now, for some of us, it is very much ranting and raving and venting and all that type of thing. But and that's fine. We've got to release it in some way. But the thing that we all need to remember is that often the decisions we make in those in those moments aren't always the best decisions. We often, many of us have run into that and perhaps regret it, in a couple of days' time or in the moment immediately afterwards. So there's something about even taking those breaths just to calm us down to make better decisions. But I think, as you say, that if it's not quite working for you and it's not quite going far enough, then perhaps it is time for a little bit more help. And I think that's a sensible approach, George, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Nature's not there to judge us. It's a healer, isn't it? I love that.
That's why it's a great equalizer. It will never judge. Yeah. It will never judge. And that's why it can feel really safe when we're out there. But I think for a lot of us, it's just building that confidence, isn't it? And understanding that nature will help us if we let nature into our lives.
Exactly. So I want to ask you about your legacy, and I don't know why I put this question on, Mike. I just feel such a big question, and I'm excited to see where you go. So the question says, for Yorkshire, for the Wildlife Trusts, or even you personally, what legacy do you hope to leave behind you?
Well, the legacy for the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust is it's easy. It's easy to say. And that is to make Yorkshire a wilder place. I mean, that's what we're all committed to. And recovering nature across the county is something we're working hard to do every day now. But I think, in a more nuanced form, that does reflect some of my own, because, I've had a lengthy career in the sector. I've been lucky enough to sort of diversify in some of my sort of career choices. But the legacy I hope I leave is that I just hope I've made a difference at somewhere. And that's why I think the ecotherapy side of the work I've done in the sector has felt more obvious, because it's very much more immediate. The problem with a lot of nature conservation work is it takes decades, and you can do a lot of work planting trees or restoring river, but it's not for 10, 20 years later you begin to see a little bit of difference. So it can be a bit soul destroying at times when you're doing all this work and it's for future generations, but that's what you've got to tell yourself. So I think that sense of more immediate reward comes from working with people, seeing young people particularly inspired into letting nature into their lives, either working in it or being healed by it or just enjoying it. To me, inspiring a young person to feel like that is very, very rewarding. And I think the more I can help with that now in the sort of twilight years of my career, the more I will feel very, very sort of rewarded and pleased that the work I've been doing has made that difference.
Well, look, you've inspired me since the day I first saw that you worked in river restoration, and I wouldn't let you get out my side because I wanted you to help me. And as I must say, yeah, you're so inspiring, and your connection between like the counselling role and the nature conservation role is just like, for me, it's like a dream. And I really do admire the work you do. And it's been great to learn a little bit more about how that started as well, actually, with that warden job. And I think maybe those warden jobs are probably, like the London Wildlife Trust, for example, has a similar role I've seen someone on social media talking about. And I think the wildlife trusts are championing those roles these days. And so if somebody maybe is listening to this as a young person, or maybe someone looking to get into this work with the wildlife trusts or in kind of any sort of space like this, is there anything you would recommend to our listeners out there that are maybe fancying getting a bit green fingered in their future careers?
I would certainly sort of say that what we talked about in terms of the volunteering opportunities earlier, George, is a great opportunity for everybody to get involved, because it's very much, people can get involved in terms of how much or how little they'd like to be involved, and there's many different roles that the Wildlife Trust movement, for example, can offer. So that's a great sort of road in to learning more about nature, learning more about how they can work in nature, and spending a bit of time just volunteering. And of course, the great thing about the volunteering, it builds that experience up. And it can really add to the CV then if people do actually want to work in the sector. So I would simply say, look at how you can volunteer with your local wildlife trust. If you look at the central sort of the wildlifetrust.org, that will signpost you to your local wildlife trust, where you could perhaps become a member. You know, the Wildlife Trust movement is a membership organisation. We need our sort of members to help fund the work we do, but of course, with that creates all these opportunities for volunteers. And you know, we're so lucky to have 45,000 members and growing in Yorkshire, which is absolutely super.
Wow.
And you know, over 1,000 volunteers. So you know, lots of opportunities, but that's certainly a good starting point.
Love it. Thank you so much, Mike. So I always grab you on LinkedIn and pick your brains on there. People happy to add you on LinkedIn. Are you okay with that? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Nice. And then obviously the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, a massive organisation. Hit them into any Google, any search engine. Probably shouldn't rep Google. Ecosia will rep on this one, the one that plants trees, the non-profit search engine, shall we? So if you can search up Yorkshire Wildlife Trust as well, you can go straight to their website. And then, of course, it was MyPlace at Lancashire Wildlife Trust.
It was,
as well. People might want to have a little research in Google. Anything else to share with the listeners? Any contact information or anything else you wanted to say, Mike, before we end the pod?
I think that's all the contact information, George. Just a big thank you for today. And please do. Anybody listening, please get in touch if there's any more information you'd like.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. It's honestly a pleasure to do this and to get your expertise shared with the listeners of the Charity Questions podcast. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks, George. Take care.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Charity Questions podcast, brought to you by the Directory of Social Change. If you want to get more involved with this podcast, follow us along on social media, where we announce the guests we have upcoming, and you can contribute your own questions for me to ask on the podcast. Thanks again for listening.